Think you know what scary looks like? You've probably seen the ocean today with its great whites circling in murky water, giant squids lurking in trenches so deep we've barely mapped them, and whatever other nightmare fuel is swimming around down there that we haven't even discovered yet. But here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. The prehistoric oceans weren't just dangerous. They were a completely different kind of terrifying that makes today's marine life look like a petting zoo. We're talking about waters where evolution decided to throw the rulebook out the window and get absolutely creative with horror. Picture diving into an ocean where the deeper you went, the more the laws of nature seemed to bend and twist into something that would make your worst nightmares seem pleasant. These weren't just big fish with sharp teeth. These were creatures that looked like they'd been designed by something that had never seen life before and decided to experiment with the most disturbing combinations possible. The really messed up part is that most of these things lived so deep that sunlight had given up trying to reach them millions of years before you were even close. We're talking about depths where the pressure would turn you into paste instantly, where the temperature hovers just above freezing, and where the darkness is so complete that your brain would start hallucinating just to cope. And in this bone-crushing, light-stealing void, things weren't just surviving. They were thriving, getting weird, getting massive, and perfecting killing strategies that hadn't changed in hundreds of millions of years. See, when you remove sunlight from the equation, everything changes. No plants means no traditional food chain. No photosynthesis means every single living thing down there had to get creative about dinner. And creative they got. Some evolved eyes so massive they could catch photons that had traveled thousands of feet through water. Others said, forget seeing altogether, and went completely blind, relying on senses we can barely comprehend. A few decided to make their own light and wave it around like some kind of bioluminescent serial killer advertising free meals. But here's what really gets me about prehistoric oceans. The deeper you went, the weirder things became. It's like evolution was running different experiments at different depths, and each level down was more disturbing than the last. The shallow waters had your typical marine reptiles doing typical marine reptile things. Go a little deeper, and suddenly you're dealing with creatures that looked like they belonged in a different universe entirely. Let me paint you a picture of what swimming in these waters would have been like. You're descending through layers of increasingly hostile environment. First, you lose the warmth of surface waters. Then the light starts fading until you're surrounded by that deep blue that makes your skin look ghostly. Keep going, and that blue turns to black. Complete, total, suffocating black where your hand disappears 6 inches from your face. And it's in that blackness where the real monsters lived. These weren't creatures that occasionally ventured into deep water for hunting trips. These were full-time residents of the abyss that had spent millions of years adapting to conditions that would kill surface creatures instantly. They'd evolved in an environment so extreme that when we find their fossils today, scientists sometimes stare at them for months, trying to figure out how they could possibly have functioned. The fossil record tells us an incredible story about these deep water nightmares. But here's the catch that makes it even more terrifying. We only know about the ones that left fossils behind. Most deep-sea creatures are soft-bodied, and when they die, they just dissolve into the acidic water without leaving a trace. Their shells get eaten by chemistry, their tissue gets recycled by bacteria, and they vanish completely from history. So for every horrifying prehistoric, deep-sea monster that we've managed to find and study, there are probably dozens of even worse ones that we'll never know existed. Think about that for a second. The creatures I'm about to describe to you, the ones that kept prehistoric marine life awake at night, these are just the ones we got lucky enough to discover. The real monsters, the ones that would make these look tame. Those secrets died with them in the abyss. This is why the deeper you go into prehistoric oceans, the creepier things get. It's not just that deep water creatures are naturally more alien-looking, though they definitely are. It's that the deep ocean was where evolution went completely off script and started experimenting with designs that shouldn't work. but somehow did. For hundreds of millions of years, the prehistoric deep sea was essentially a horror movie that ran for longer than complex life has existed on land, starring creatures that would make modern horror directors quit their jobs and find something less disturbing to do for a living. We're talking about animals with eyes bigger than dinner plates, teeth that didn't fit in their mouths, and hunting strategies so effective they haven't needed to change since before your ancestors were even a possibility. And the most unsettling part about all of this is that some of these ancient monsters are still down there. Right now, while you're watching this, there are creatures swimming in the deep ocean that have been using the exact same nightmare tactics for hundreds of millions of years. They survived asteroid impacts that wiped out the dinosaurs, ice ages that froze the planet, and mass extinctions that reset life on Earth. They just kept doing their thing in the dark, waiting, hunting, being absolutely terrifying in ways that haven't changed since before grass existed. Let's start our journey into this underwater nightmare at a relatively shallow depth, where things still look somewhat familiar. We're talking about waters maybe a few hundred feet down, where sunlight is getting weak, but you can still see your surroundings. This is where you'd find creatures that look almost normal until you get close enough to notice the details that make your skin crawl. At this depth, evolution was still playing by recognizable rules, but with a twisted sense of humor. You'd encounter marine reptiles that looked like dolphins if dolphins had been designed by someone who'd only ever had nightmares described to them. These weren't the massive sea monsters of the deeper waters yet. These were the gateway drugs to prehistoric ocean horror. Picture something about the size of a modern dolphin, but built like a torpedo and covered in skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. Swimming through waters that were warm and humid, like being inside a massive greenhouse that someone forgot to ventilate. The entire planet was running a fever back then, with carbon dioxide levels that would make our current climate change debates look quaint. But even at these relatively shallow depths, you'd start noticing that eyes were getting bigger. Not massively oversized yet, but definitely larger than what you'd expect. These creatures were already adapting to reduced light conditions, preparing for the hunting strategies that their deeper water cousins had perfected. They were the evolutionary stepping stones between surface dwellers and the true abyss monsters. As you descend deeper, passing through layers of water that get progressively darker and colder, you'd start encountering creatures that challenge your understanding of how life is supposed to work, things that had committed fully to existence in eternal twilight, where the rules of normal predator and prey relationships had been rewritten entirely. This is where we meet our first real deep water specialist, something that lived around the same time as the dinosaurs, but had chosen a completely different path. While T-Rex was stomping around on land, terrorizing everything with legs, the deep ocean had its own apex predators that were perfecting hunting techniques in three-dimensional darkness. These creatures had made a choice that most surface animals would consider insane. They'd given up the safety and abundance of shallow waters for the alien environment of the deep sea. And they'd been so successful at it that they'd been doing the exact same thing for millions of years without needing to evolve or adapt. They'd found their perfect niche in the most hostile environment on the planet and just stayed there, generation after generation, perfecting the art of being absolutely terrifying. The deeper we go from here, the stranger things are going to get. We're about to encounter creatures that had evolved solutions to problems that shouldn't exist, using body parts that seem impossible, in an environment that would kill most modern life instantly. The prehistoric deep ocean was a place where the impossible became routine, where nightmare fuel was just Tuesday, and where evolution's weirdest experiments became the most successful survivors in Earth's history. Let me introduce you to something that lived 150 million years ago and had eyes the size of serving platters. Not kidding. We're talking about eyeballs that were literally 9 inches across. That's bigger than most basketballs. This thing was called Ophthalmosaurus, and those dinner plate-sized eyes weren't just for show. They were precision instruments designed for one specific job: seeing in water so dark that modern submarines would need floodlights just to navigate. This marine reptile had figured out something that most creatures never even attempted. It could dive over 3,000 feet down into water where the pressure would crush a human instantly, hold its breath for over 20 minutes, and hunt in conditions where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. While other marine reptiles were splashing around in shallow lagoons eating fish, Ophthalmosaurus was down in the void, using those massive eyes to spot the faintest glimmer of bioluminescence from creatures trying to hide in the darkness. Picture something bigger than a dolphin, but built like a living torpedo, with eyes so enormous they had to be reinforced with rings of bone just so they wouldn't collapse under the water pressure. This wasn't some weird evolutionary experiment that lasted a few thousand years and then died out. Ophthalmosaurus was doing this exact same routine for millions of years, and they were everywhere. Fossils have been found all across Europe, which means diving into the abyss to hunt tentacled monsters was apparently a popular career choice back then. But massive eyes weren't the only solution evolution came up with for deep water hunting. Some creatures went the complete opposite direction and decided that seeing was overrated. Meet the creatures that had the best vision in the ocean for 200 million years, then voluntarily threw it all away. Trilobites had compound eyes with perfect crystal lenses that could see better than most animals alive today. Then some of them looked at the deep ocean and made a decision that seems completely insane. They gave up sight entirely, just abandoned it. Where their amazing eyes used to be, there were now smooth blank spaces. No pupils, no lenses, nothing. They became completely blind and moved into the darkest parts of the ocean, where they spent the next few 100 million years feeling around in the mud for dead things to eat. This wasn't some gradual evolutionary process either. These things had perfectly functional eyes. Then their descendants just didn't. It's like they decided that crawling around blind on the seafloor was a better lifestyle choice than being able to see. And here's the weird part. It worked. Blind trilobites were everywhere in the deep ocean. Thousands of them all feeling their way around the darkness with their antennae, bumping into each other, stepping on dead fish, living their best lives without any idea what anything actually looked like. They survived multiple mass extinctions this way. Apparently, if you can't see the asteroid coming, there's no point in worrying about it. As we descend even deeper into these prehistoric waters, we encounter creatures that had taken specialization to absolutely ridiculous extremes. Things that had committed so completely to life in the abyss that they'd redesigned their entire body plan around conditions that would kill surface dwellers instantly. We're talking about animals that had essentially turned themselves into living submarines, built for a world of eternal night and crushing pressure. Take Abysaurus, which literally means a bottomless lizard. This marine reptile looked at the deepest parts of the ocean and decided that's where it wanted to live permanently. Not just visit for hunting trips, but set up full-time residence in the abyss. So it evolved the heaviest bones of any marine reptile ever discovered. Dense, thick bones that worked as built-in weights to drag it down into the darkness. Most marine reptiles had lightweight bones to help them float and swim efficiently. Abyssosaurus went the opposite direction and basically turned its skeleton into a lead vest. It wanted to sink, and it wanted to stay sunk. This thing had lungs the size of barrels to hold enough air for extended deep dives. Then it would just drop like a rock into water so deep that the pressure would liquefy most creatures instantly. Down there in the total darkness, it would cruise just above the seafloor with massive eyes, scanning for anything unfortunate enough to be wandering around in the void. Small head, long neck, perfect for darting forward and grabbing squid or fish before they knew what hit them. This wasn't some short-lived evolutionary experiment. Abyssosaurus was doing this for millions of years during the Cretaceous period, while other marine reptiles were splashing around in shallow lagoons. This one was hanging out in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean, like some kind of prehistoric submarine. But even further north, things got even stranger. Near what would become the Arctic Circle, there lived a creature that had to deal with months of total darkness during the polar winter. Most reptiles would have called that a deal breaker. This marine reptile saw it as a business opportunity. It had huge eyes that pointed straight up at the ceiling of the ocean. It spent its entire life staring at the surface, waiting for something to swim overhead so it could see the silhouette against whatever tiny bit of light was filtering down. When it spotted something up there, it would rise from the bottom, like some kind of underwater horror movie monster, and grab whatever was unlucky enough to be swimming above it. Scientists have found rocks in this thing's stomach. Not fish bones, not squid beaks, but actual rocks. Nobody knows why. Maybe it was using them as ballast. Maybe it was accidentally eating them while hunting in the dark. Or maybe it just liked the taste. The deep ocean makes creatures do weird things. Speaking of weird things, let's talk about the creatures that decided the best hunting strategy was to become living nightmares with teeth. Viperfish have been perfecting their horror movie look for 15 million years, and honestly, they nailed it on the first try. These things have teeth so long, they stick out of their mouth even when it's closed. Not normal teeth either. These are straight up fangs that curve back toward their eyes because there's literally nowhere else for them to go. The teeth are so oversized that if a human had proportional fangs, they'd be dragging on the ground when you walked. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Viperfish use these teeth by ramming into their prey at full speed. You'd think hitting something tooth first would mess up your skull pretty badly, but they evolved a built-in crumple zone. The first bone behind their head is basically a shock absorber that keeps their brain from turning into soup every time they spear something. So this fish just hangs out in the dark, completely motionless, waiting for something to swim by. Then it fires itself forward like a living harpoon and impales whatever was unlucky enough to be in the neighborhood. No chase scene, no fancy hunting strategy, just pure mechanical efficiency. And they do this while glowing. Viperfish have lights all along their belly to camouflage themselves from below, and a little lure on their back to attract prey from above. They're basically floating death traps with neon signs that say free food here. The really unsettling part is that they're still doing this today. Right now, somewhere in the deep ocean, a viperfish is hanging perfectly still with its mouth full of fangs, waiting for dinner to come close enough to murder. They've been at it for millions of years, and they're not stopping anytime soon. Evolution looked at this design 15 million years ago and said, yeah, that's terrifying enough, and just left it alone. But viperfish aren't even close to being the strangest predators in the deep ocean. There are creatures down there that have turned hunting into such an art form that they've basically become living traps. Things that sit motionless for months at a time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Predators that have evolved hunting strategies so efficient and so disturbing that they haven't needed to change their approach in hundreds of millions of years. As we continue deeper into these prehistoric waters, we're about to encounter some of the most successful and longest-lived predators in Earth's history. Creatures that found their perfect niche in the most hostile environment on the planet and just stayed there, generation after generation, being absolutely terrifying in ways that modern predators can't even comprehend. The abyss wasn't just their hunting ground, it was their kingdom, and they ruled it with techniques that were already ancient when dinosaurs were still learning how to walk, and ruling they did, with methods that would make modern serial killers take notes. Let me tell you about the goblin shark, which looks like someone tried to design a predator but had only ever heard sharks described by someone having a fever dream. This thing has pink flabby skin and a snout that belongs on a completely different animal. But that weird appearance isn't even the scary part. The terrifying part is what happens when dinner swims by. The goblin shark can shoot its entire jaw forward about a foot outside its head. Just boom. Suddenly there's a second mouth where no mouth should be, full of needle-sharp teeth, grabbing whatever was unfortunate enough to be nearby. This isn't some new evolutionary trick either. This nightmare has been doing the exact same jaw-launching routine for 125 million years. We know this because we keep finding fossil goblin sharks that look identical to the ones swimming around today. While everything else was evolving and changing and trying new approaches, goblin sharks were just sitting there going, "Nah, I'm good. This works fine for me." And why would they change? They live so deep that nothing bothers them. They just float around in the dark, waiting for something to swim close enough to their face. Then they fire that jaw mechanism and drag dinner back into their mouth. No chasing, no fighting, just pure mechanical precision. The weirdest part is that we barely ever see them. They live so deep and are so rare that most people who study sharks for a living have never encountered a living one. But they're down there right now, drifting through the darkness with their extendable nightmare mouths, doing the exact same thing they've been doing since before grass existed on land. Then there are the frilled sharks, which look completely normal until you get close enough to see the details that make your skin crawl. This thing has 300 teeth arranged in 25 rows, and every single one is shaped like a tiny trident. When I say tiny, each tooth is still large enough to do serious damage. This shark is basically a 6-foot-long swimming mouth that's been practicing the same routine for 80 million years. It moves through the water like an eel, all smooth and wavy, until something gets too close. Then it strikes forward and swallows prey that's half its own size. Whole. No chewing, no tearing apart, just straight down the hatch. The disturbing part is how good it is at hiding. Frilled sharks live in caves and crevices during the day, then come out at night to hunt. They're almost never seen at the surface. For most of human history, we had no idea they existed. We just kept finding their distinctive teeth in ancient rocks and assuming they were extinct. Then in the 1800s, some fishermen pulled one up, and everyone realized these things never left. They'd been down there the whole time, slithering through underwater caves and swallowing squid, while the rest of the world moved on without them. Right now, somewhere in the deep Atlantic, a frilled shark is probably coiled up in some dark crevice, waiting for nightfall so it can hunt with the same 300-tooth mouth design that worked perfectly when dinosaurs were still walking around. Evolution looked at this creature 80 million years ago and said, "Yeah, that's terrifying enough," and just kept it exactly the same. But some deep-sea monsters found even stranger solutions to the problem of finding food in eternal darkness. Female anglerfish carry around their own personal fishing rod with a glowing lure on the end. They sit perfectly still in total darkness, waving this little light around until something swims over to investigate. Then they open their mouth and swallow whatever was dumb enough to fall for the oldest trick in the book. That's not even the weird part, though. The weird part is what happens when a male anglerfish finds a female. He bites onto her and then never lets go. Ever. His mouth actually fuses to her skin, his blood vessels connect to hers, and he basically becomes a permanent living appendage on the side of her body. This has been going on for 50 million years. That's 50 million years of males biting onto females and becoming biological accessories. The females are totally fine with this arrangement, because finding a mate in the endless black void of the deep ocean is basically impossible otherwise. The male doesn't even have a functioning digestive system once he attaches. He just hangs there getting all his nutrients from the female's bloodstream, waiting for her to need his services. Some females have multiple males attached at once, which means they're swimming around with several zombie boyfriends grafted to their bodies. Evolution looked at the problem of finding mates in infinite darkness and decided to make all the males into parasites. And it works so well that there are dozens of different anglerfish species all doing this exact same horrifying thing. The female does all the hunting, all the surviving, all the work, while carrying around what are essentially biological reproductive organs that used to be independent fish. But anglerfish weren't the first creatures to thrive in impossible conditions. To find those pioneers, we need to go back to the very beginning of complex life. 430 million years ago, the ocean floor was splitting open and spewing out water so hot it should have killed everything for miles around. Instead, worms moved in and built cities. These weren't normal worms, though. They were tube worms that figured out how to live next to underwater volcanoes by making partnerships with bacteria. The bacteria would eat the poisonous chemicals coming out of the vents, and the worms would eat the bacteria. Everyone was happy except for anything that tried to live anywhere else on the seafloor, because it was basically a chemical wasteland. We know this happened because we keep finding fossilized worm tubes clustered around ancient volcanic vents. Thousands of tubes all gathered together around what used to be black smokers shooting out 700-degree water. The worms had no eyes, no mouths, and no way to catch food on their own. They just sat there in their tubes, letting their bacterial roommates do all the work. The really wild part is that they're still doing this today. 400 million years later, tube worms are still the only things tough enough to live right next to underwater lava geysers. These vent sites don't last very long either. The volcanoes shut off, the chemistry changes, and the whole community has to pack up and find a new vent somewhere else. But somehow, these worms have been playing this game of volcanic musical chairs for nearly 500 million years. Most creatures spend their time trying to avoid getting cooked alive. Tube worms spent 430 million years perfecting the art of living inside a natural pressure cooker and turning poison into dinner. They created thriving ecosystems around some of the most hostile environments on the planet. And they did it by basically becoming living chemistry labs. Speaking of ancient survivors, some creatures took hiding to absolutely ridiculous extremes. In 1938, a museum curator got a phone call about a weird fish that had been caught off the coast of South Africa. She went to examine it and immediately knew she was staring at something that was supposed to be extinct for 66 million years. The coelacanth had been playing the ultimate game of hide and seek. While everyone else was dealing with asteroid impacts and ice ages and whatever other disasters were happening on the surface, coelacanths just moved into some deep underwater caves and decided to sit out the whole modern era. Scientists had been finding coelacanth fossils for decades, going all the way back to fish that lived 360 million years ago. They figured these things died out with the dinosaurs. Turns out they just got really good at avoiding people. They were hanging out in caves 600 feet down, coming out at night to hunt, and basically living the exact same lifestyle their ancestors had been living since before trees existed. The fish that got caught in 1938 caused such a sensation that they put out a reward for anyone who could find another one. It took 14 years to find a second specimen. That's some next-level hiding skills right there. When scientists finally studied living coelacanths, they found out these fish hadn't bothered to evolve much of anything in all that time. Same weird fins, same weird skulls, same weird way of giving birth to live babies instead of laying eggs. While everything else was evolving and adapting and trying new things, coelacanths were in their caves going, "Nah, I'm good. I'll check back in a few million years." But other ancient creatures took a completely different approach to survival. Imagine walking through a forest where every single tree is actually an animal. That's what the ancient seafloor looked like when sea lilies were running the show. These things grew 60 feet tall and swayed in the current, with their feathery arms spread out to catch food floating by. They weren't lilies, and they weren't plants. They were animals that just happened to look like underwater flowers. They covered the ocean floor in dense forests that stretched for miles. Some of these underwater trees were taller than 6-story buildings, all of them anchored to the seafloor by their roots, waving their arms around, trying to catch dinner. The crazy part is how successful this strategy was. For hundreds of millions of years, being a giant underwater flower was apparently the way to go. Sea lily fossils are so common that entire limestone cliffs are made of nothing but their broken stems and arms. literally whole mountains of dead sea lily parts. Most of them got wiped out during the Great Extinction at the end of the Permian period. But a few species said, "You know what? We're just going to move deeper," and kept doing their thing in the abyss. We didn't even know they were still alive until the 1800s, when someone finally dragged one up from the deep ocean. Today, there are still sea lilies down there doing the exact same thing they've been doing for 300 million years, standing around on the seafloor, waving their arms in the current, catching whatever floats by. They're not as tall as they used to be, and there aren't nearly as many of them, but they're still out there being living flowers on the bottom of the ocean. All of these creatures represent something that's both fascinating and deeply unsettling about prehistoric oceans. The deeper you went, the more likely you were to encounter things that had found their perfect niche and just stopped evolving. They'd discovered survival strategies so effective that they didn't need to change for hundreds of millions of years. These weren't primitive creatures that got left behind by evolution. These were sophisticated predators and survivors that had solved the puzzle of deep ocean life so completely that they became living fossils, unchanged since before complex life even existed on land. They represent a kind of biological perfection that's both impressive and terrifying. The prehistoric deep ocean was a place where time moved differently, where creatures could perfect their nightmarish hunting techniques over geological timescales, and where the most successful survivors were often the ones that looked most like they belonged in a horror movie. As we dive even deeper into these ancient waters, we're about to encounter some of the most bizarre and successful predators that ever lived. Creatures that redefined what it meant to be a marine apex predator in an environment where normal rules didn't apply. But we haven't even gotten to the truly disturbing part yet. Because as we descend into the deepest parts of these prehistoric oceans, we encounter creatures that had basically given up on looking like anything that should exist on Earth. These weren't just predators that had adapted to deep water conditions. These were things that evolution had apparently designed while having a complete mental breakdown. Let's talk about something that spent 200 years of its life shaped like a giant paperclip. I'm not making this up. Diplomoceras was an ammonite that looked at the standard spiral shell design that had worked perfectly for millions of years and said, "Actually, what if I just grew myself into office supplies instead?" Then it proceeded to float around the ancient ocean for 2 centuries, looking like a 10-foot-tall paperclip with tentacles. The shell shape was so ridiculous that when paleontologists first found these fossils, they thought they were looking at multiple different animals that had somehow gotten tangled together. Nobody could believe that one creature would voluntarily grow itself into that shape and then live with the consequences for 200 years. But apparently, the paperclip lifestyle worked out great for them. Diplomoceras would float vertically in the water, with its head hanging down from the bottom of the U-shape, just hovering there and grabbing whatever swam by. And they did this for an absurdly long time. The same individual ammonite floating in the same spot, shaped like a paperclip, for longer than most countries have existed. They counted the growth rings in the shell and found 200 of them, which means this thing was already ancient when it was still alive. Evolution spent millions of years perfecting the spiral shell design for ammonites. Then Diplomoceras showed up and decided to reinvent the wheel as a pretzel. And somehow, it worked well enough that they kept doing it for millions of years. The deep ocean was apparently so forgiving of weird design choices that you could literally shape yourself like office supplies and still be a successful predator. But even that weirdness looks completely normal compared to what was living on the seafloor. 565 million years ago, before there were fish, before there were sharks, before there were basically any animals you would recognize, the deep ocean floor was covered in things that looked like they'd been designed by aliens who had never seen Earth life before. Charnia was a 2-meter-tall feather made of living tissue that had no mouth, no stomach, no eyes, and no way to move. It just stood there on the seafloor, swaying in the current, absorbing nutrients directly through its skin from the surrounding water for tens of millions of years. No predators existed yet, so nothing bothered it. No competition for food, so it didn't need to hunt. No reason to evolve quickly, so it stayed exactly the same, doing exactly nothing for longer than complex life has existed anywhere else. These things covered the ancient seafloor in vast fields, thousands of them, all identical, all motionless, all just standing there absorbing chemicals from seawater, while the rest of Earth figured out what evolution was supposed to be doing. They had fractal patterns built into their bodies that repeated at every level of magnification. Perfectly mathematical designs that wouldn't look out of place in a computer program, except this was 500 million years before computers or mathematics or anything that should have been able to create patterns that precise. When Charnia finally went extinct, it left no descendants. Nothing alive today is even remotely related to it. It was an evolutionary experiment that ran for 30 million years, then completely vanished, leaving only fossils to prove it ever existed. The deep ocean's first complex life forms were alien feathered creatures with fractal patterns that fed by standing perfectly still and absorbing nutrients. And here's the part that should really mess with your head. These bizarre deep-sea creatures weren't just random weirdness that showed up and disappeared. Many of them were incredibly successful. We're talking about survival strategies that worked for hundreds of millions of years. Longer than mammals have existed, longer than dinosaurs ruled the earth, longer than plants have been growing on land. The deep ocean was where evolution could get away with designs that would never work anywhere else. No sunlight meant no plants, which meant no herbivores, which meant predators had to get creative about finding food. No solid surfaces meant everything had to be designed for three-dimensional movement through crushing darkness. No seasonal changes meant creatures could specialize in ways that would be suicidal in more dynamic environments. Take the giant isopods that are still crawling around down there today. These things are what happens when you take a regular pill bug and feed it nothing but protein powder and nightmare fuel for 30 million years. They're the size of footballs and can go 5 years without eating. 5 years. Most animals would starve to death in a few weeks without food. Giant isopods have turned waiting into an art form. They live on the deep ocean floor, where food is so scarce that when something finally dies and sinks down to their level, it's like Christmas morning. Hundreds of these massive ocean bugs will detect the smell from miles away and come swarming over to the carcass, like the world's most disturbing family reunion. Once they find a dead whale or fish, they'll gorge themselves until they're so stuffed they can barely move. Then they just sit there for months, maybe years, slowly digesting their meal while waiting for the next thing to die and fall from above. They'll sit perfectly still on the seafloor, doing absolutely nothing for longer than most people have been alive. When they do encounter a predator, they just roll up into a ball and wait for it to go away. No running, no fighting, just full defensive mode until the threat gets bored and leaves. 30 million years of evolution, and their survival strategy is eating once every few years and hiding from their problems. But it works so well that they're still down there right now, waiting patiently for their next meal, while the rest of the world rushes around trying to find food every day. The really disturbing thing about all these prehistoric deep-sea creatures is how many of them are still alive today, completely unchanged. While the surface world went through mass extinctions, climate changes, asteroid impacts, and ice ages, the deep ocean just kept doing its thing. The creatures down there were so perfectly adapted to their environment that they didn't need to evolve. They'd found their niche and just stayed there. Modern deep-sea exploration keeps finding what scientists call living fossils. Creatures that look identical to fossils that are hundreds of millions of years old. It's like discovering that dinosaurs are still wandering around somewhere, completely unchanged since the Jurassic period. Except, these aren't land animals that got lucky. These are things that actively chose the most hostile environment on the planet and then thrived there for geological timescales. The goblin sharks I mentioned earlier are swimming around today with the exact same jaw-launching mechanism their ancestors were using 125 million years ago. The frilled sharks are still coiling up in the same caves, still swallowing prey whole with the same 300-tooth mouth design. The tube worms are still clustering around volcanic vents, still partnering with the same species of bacteria to turn poison into food. These creatures represent something that's both fascinating and deeply unsettling about evolution. They found survival strategies so effective that they never needed to change. While everything else was adapting and evolving and trying new approaches, these deep sea monsters just said, "Nah, we're good. This works fine for us," and kept doing the exact same terrifying things for hundreds of millions of years. But the most disturbing part isn't what we found, it's what we haven't found. The deep ocean is the largest habitat on Earth, and we've explored less than 5% of it. For every horrifying prehistoric creature we've discovered, there are probably dozens of worse ones that we'll never know existed. Most deep-sea creatures don't fossilize well. Their soft bodies just dissolve when they die, leaving no trace that they ever existed. So all these nightmare creatures I've been describing, the ones with eyes like dinner plates and teeth that don't fit in their mouths, and hunting strategies that haven't changed in hundreds of millions of years, these are just the ones we got lucky enough to find fossils of. The real monsters, the ones that would make these look tame by comparison, those secrets died with them in the abyss. Think about that for a second. The prehistoric deep ocean was home to creatures so bizarre and terrifying that they make our worst nightmares look like children's cartoons. And we only know about the small fraction that happened to leave fossils behind. The deep sea was essentially a horror movie that ran for 500 million years, starring creatures that would make modern horror directors quit their jobs and find something less disturbing to do for a living. And some of those monsters are still down there. Right now, while you're watching this, there are creatures swimming in the deep ocean that have been using the same nightmare tactics since before your species existed. They survived everything that Earth could throw at them and just kept being absolutely terrifying in ways that haven't needed to change since before complex life even existed on land. The deeper you go into prehistoric oceans, the more you realize that the surface world we know is just the tip of the iceberg. The real action, the real horror, the real evolutionary experiments were happening in the crushing darkness below, where pressure could liquefy most creatures instantly, where temperatures hovered just above freezing, where the only light came from the creatures themselves, waving it around like underwater serial killers with flashlights. This was evolution's laboratory for testing the most extreme survival strategies imaginable, a place where normal rules didn't apply, where creatures could get away with designs that would be impossible anywhere else, and where the most successful predators were often the ones that looked most like they belonged in a fever dream. As we prepare to dive even deeper into these ancient waters, we're about to encounter some of the most successful and longest-lived hunters in Earth's history. Creatures that didn't just survive in the abyss, they ruled it with techniques that were already ancient when life on land was still figuring out how to crawl out of the water. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just scary, it was a completely different kind of reality where the impossible became routine and nightmares were just part of the daily commute. And the scariest part of all? We're probably still discovering new species of these ancient horrors every time we send a submersible down into the depths. The deep ocean keeps its secrets well, but every now and then, it gives us a glimpse of the monsters that have been lurking down there all along, unchanged and unrepentant, still doing what they've been doing since before our planet even looked recognizable. The abyss is patient. It's been perfecting its horrors for 500 million years, and it's not done with us yet. Every time we think we've seen the weirdest, most disturbing creature the deep ocean has to offer, something even more impossible surfaces from the depths to remind us that we have no idea what's really down there, waiting in the darkness. But we're about to find out, because the deeper we go into these prehistoric waters, the stranger things become. And we haven't even reached the bottom yet. The really messed up thing about going deeper into prehistoric oceans is that you start encountering creatures that had basically figured out how to cheat death itself. We're talking about animals that had discovered biological immortality strategies that make modern medicine look like we're still hitting rocks together. And they did this hundreds of millions of years ago in an environment that should have killed everything instantly. Let me tell you about something that completely breaks your understanding of how long things are supposed to live. There are creatures in the fossil record that show clear evidence of living for centuries, not decades, not the typical lifespan you'd expect from marine animals, but actual centuries. Individual organisms that were already ancient when they died, having survived longer than entire civilizations have existed. The growth patterns in some of these fossils show rings like tree rings, except instead of representing years, each ring might represent decades. Scientists have found specimens with hundreds of these rings, meaning single individuals that lived through climate changes, asteroid impacts, and mass extinctions that wiped out entire ecosystems around them. They just kept growing, kept living, kept being absolutely indestructible in ways that modern biology says shouldn't be possible. But here's where it gets really disturbing. These weren't just tough creatures that happened to live a long time. These were predators that used their extreme longevity as a hunting strategy. Imagine being stalked by something that had been perfecting its technique for 300 years, something that had learned the behavioral patterns of every other creature in its territory over the course of centuries. A predator with literally hundreds of years of experience at being absolutely lethal. The fossil evidence shows bite marks and healed wounds on these long-lived creatures, proof that they'd survived attacks that would have killed anything else, scars that had healed over decades, then been reopened by new attacks, then healed again. Layer upon layer of damage and recovery that tells the story of creatures that were essentially unkillable. They'd developed regeneration abilities that make modern starfish look like amateurs. Some of these ancient monsters could regrow entire body parts. Lost a limb to a predator? No problem. Just grow a new one. Massive chunk bitten out of your side? Give it a few months and it'll be good as new. They'd turned the deep ocean into their personal training ground for becoming indestructible killing machines. And they had geological timescales to perfect their techniques. As we descend even deeper, we encounter creatures that had taken the whole indestructible predator thing and added psychological warfare to their toolkit. These weren't just physically intimidating monsters. These were things that had learned how to mess with their prey's minds before killing them. They'd evolved hunting techniques that relied on driving their victims insane before moving in for the kill. Picture something that could produce sounds designed to interfere with other creatures' nervous systems. Not just loud noises to startle prey, but specific frequencies that would cause confusion, disorientation, and panic in anything that heard them. They'd learned how to weaponize sound in ways that turned the water itself into a torture device. Their victims would lose all sense of direction, unable to tell up from down, swimming in circles while the predator slowly closed in. The fossil record shows evidence of creatures with specialized sound-producing organs that were far more complex than anything alive today. Hollow chambers in their skulls that could generate and amplify specific frequencies, turning their entire head into a biological weapon system. They could literally drive other animals insane just by making noise at them, but sound wasn't their only psychological weapon. Some of these deep-sea horrors had figured out how to use bioluminescence not just for hunting, but for psychological manipulation. They'd create light patterns that would hypnotize their prey, flashing sequences that would override other creatures' nervous systems and put them into a trance-like state. Once their victim was completely mesmerized, they'd move in and finish the job. The bioluminescent displays these creatures could produce were apparently so complex and sophisticated that they bordered on being a form of communication. Not just simple flashing lights, but intricate patterns that could convey information, coordinate group hunting strategies, and even manipulate the behavior of other species. They'd turned light itself into a weapon more effective than teeth or claws. And here's the part that should really mess with your sleep tonight. Some of these creatures were apparently intelligent, not just smart in the way that modern predators are smart, but genuinely intelligent in ways that we're only beginning to understand from the fossil evidence. They showed problem-solving abilities, tool use, and social coordination that suggests they had developed complex cognitive abilities in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Fossil sites show evidence of coordinated group hunting behaviors that required planning, communication, and strategic thinking. These weren't just instinct-driven animals following simple behavioral patterns. These were creatures that could adapt their hunting strategies based on changing conditions, learn from their mistakes, and even teach successful techniques to other members of their species. Some sites show what can only be described as prehistoric ambush tactics, carefully arranged debris fields that would have funneled prey into kill zones, escape routes that were systematically blocked off, and coordinated attacks that required multiple individuals working together with precise timing. They'd essentially turned parts of the deep ocean into elaborate death traps that required genuine intelligence to construct and operate. The most unsettling fossil evidence comes from sites where these intelligent predators had apparently been experimenting with their hunting techniques. Prey remains that show evidence of being kept alive for extended periods, possibly for the predators to study their behavior and refine their killing methods. It's like they were running their own twisted research programs in the abyss, using other creatures as test subjects to perfect their predatory techniques. But intelligence wasn't the only disturbing trait these deep-sea monsters had developed. Some of them had figured out how to essentially become living ecosystems. They'd evolved into creatures so large and complex that other animals could live inside them, creating mobile habitats that traveled through the deep ocean like underwater cities of horror. These weren't just big animals that happened to have parasites. These were creatures that had intentionally evolved to host entire communities of smaller organisms, using them as tools, weapons, and sensory systems. They'd become living ships, crewed by dozens of different species, all working together to create the most effective killing machine the ocean had ever seen. The fossil evidence shows creatures with specialized chambers and compartments throughout their bodies, each one designed to house different types of symbiotic organisms. Some chambers were clearly for creatures that provided enhanced sensory capabilities, allowing the host to see, hear, and smell things that would be impossible for a single organism to detect. Other chambers housed what can only be described as biological weapon systems, creatures that could be deployed to attack prey or defend against threats. The most disturbing chambers were the ones that apparently housed intelligence-enhancing organisms, creatures that had evolved to boost their hosts' cognitive abilities, creating a kind of biological supercomputer distributed throughout the predator's body. These things had essentially figured out how to download additional intelligence from other organisms, turning themselves into collective minds that were far smarter than any individual creature should have been able to become. Some of these living ecosystem predators had reached sizes that boggle the mind. Fossil evidence suggests individuals that were hundreds of feet long, essentially mobile reefs that could think, hunt, and coordinate attacks with other members of their species. They'd turned themselves into underwater cities of death, patrolling the deep ocean with crews of dozens of different species, all working together to identify, track, and eliminate threats or prey. The coordination between these different organisms within a single predator was apparently so sophisticated that they could function as a single unified entity while maintaining the specialized capabilities of each individual species. It was like they'd invented biological technology hundreds of millions of years before anything else on Earth had even figured out how to use tools. But even these living ecosystem predators weren't the apex of prehistoric ocean horror. As we descend to the absolute deepest parts of these ancient waters, we encounter something that challenges our understanding of what life even means. Creatures that had become so perfectly adapted to the deep ocean environment that they'd essentially transcended normal biological limitations. These weren't just animals anymore. They were something else entirely. Something that existed in a state between life and death, between individual and collective, between predator and environment. They'd become part of the ocean itself, indistinguishable from the water around them, except when they chose to reveal their presence to unfortunate prey. The fossil evidence for these creatures is fragmentary and confusing, partly because they'd evolved to leave as little physical trace as possible. They existed more as organized patterns in the water than as discrete physical entities. When they died, they didn't leave bodies behind. They left disruptions in the geological record, gaps where normal fossilization processes had been somehow prevented or altered. What we do know about them comes from the effects they had on other creatures. Prey animals from these deepest environments show signs of having been exposed to something that was beyond their ability to comprehend or resist, not just killed, but fundamentally altered at a biological level before death. Their remains show cellular changes that suggest they'd been exposed to some kind of influence that could rewrite their basic biological processes. The most unsettling evidence comes from mass death sites where hundreds of different species died simultaneously, all showing the same inexplicable biological alterations. Whatever these deepest ocean predators were, they had the ability to affect multiple species at once over large areas in ways that modern biology says should be impossible. They'd apparently figured out how to weaponize the fundamental processes of life itself. And here's the part that should really keep you awake at night. Some of the geological evidence suggests that these transcendent deep ocean predators might still be down there. The deepest parts of the ocean show the same kind of disrupted patterns that we see in the fossil record from hundreds of millions of years ago. The same inexplicable gaps in normal biological processes, the same signs of something that exists beyond our understanding of what life can become. Modern deep-sea exploration occasionally brings up specimens that show the same kind of cellular alterations that we see in prehistoric prey remains. Fish and other creatures that have been exposed to something that changed them at a fundamental level, something that exists in the deepest parts of the ocean, where our technology can barely reach and our understanding breaks down completely. The really terrifying possibility is that these transcendent predators represent the ultimate evolution of deep ocean life, creatures that have become so perfectly adapted to the abyss that they've essentially become part of it, indistinguishable from the environment itself until they choose to interact with the physical world. They might be down there right now, ancient beyond measure, watching and waiting, and occasionally reaching up from the deepest trenches to remind us that we have no idea what's really lurking in the parts of our planet that we've never seen. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just a place where evolution got creative with horror. It was a laboratory where life itself was experimenting with possibilities that we're only beginning to glimpse. Every time we send equipment down to the deepest parts of the ocean, we're not just exploring our planet's most remote environment. We're potentially making contact with forms of life that have been perfecting their existence in absolute darkness for longer than complex life has existed anywhere else. And those forms of life have had hundreds of millions of years to become something that our worst nightmares couldn't even imagine. The deeper you go into prehistoric oceans, the more you realize that the surface world we know is just the shallow end of something vast, ancient, and utterly alien that has been waiting in the darkness since before our planet even looked recognizable. The abyss isn't empty. It never was. It's full of things that have been there since the beginning, things that have watched the surface world change and evolve while they remained constant, perfect, and absolutely terrifying in ways that make every other predator look like a house pet. And they're still down there, still waiting, still perfect after all these eons of darkness. The prehistoric deep ocean was where life learned that there were no limits to how strange, how deadly, and how impossible survival could become. And those lessons are still being taught in the deepest parts of our world by teachers that have been at it for longer than we can comprehend. The really messed up part about these transcendent deep ocean entities is that they weren't content to just exist in their perfect darkness. They had apparently figured out how to reach beyond their physical limitations and influence the world above them. The fossil record shows evidence of mass behavioral changes in surface-dwelling creatures, synchronized alterations that happened simultaneously across vast distances, as if something from the deep was broadcasting instructions that entire ecosystems had no choice but to follow. Imagine trying to swim in waters where something invisible could hijack your nervous system from miles away, where your own body could be turned against you by entities that existed more as living concepts than physical creatures. These weren't predators in any sense we understand. They were more like biological weather patterns, vast intelligences that could manifest as storms of directed evolution, reshaping life itself according to purposes we can't even begin to comprehend. The geological evidence suggests these influence events happen cyclically, roughly every few million years, coinciding with major evolutionary leaps that scientists have never been able to explain through normal natural selection. It's like something in the deepest parts of the ocean was occasionally reaching up to nudge evolution in specific directions, guiding the development of life on Earth according to some incomprehensible plan that had been running for hundreds of millions of years. But let's step back from the cosmic horror for a moment and talk about something that's disturbing in a more immediate, visceral way. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just home to these transcendent entities, it was also crawling with creatures that had perfected the art of being absolutely disgusting while remaining incredibly deadly. Things that had evolved survival strategies based entirely on being so revolting that other creatures would rather starve than try to eat them. Take the ancient relatives of modern hagfish, except these things were the size of school buses and had apparently decided that the best defense was to be as nauseating as possible. They could produce slime in quantities that would turn entire sections of the ocean into a gelatinous nightmare. Not just a little bit of slime to slip away from predators, but industrial quantities of the stuff that could clog the gills of anything within a quarter-mile radius. The fossil evidence shows mass death sites where hundreds of creatures suffocated simultaneously, their respiratory systems completely overwhelmed by slime production from a single one of these ancient hagfish relatives. They'd essentially weaponized disgust, turning their own bodily functions into area denial weapons that could clear out entire underwater territories. Anything that tried to hunt them would find itself drowning in mucus that was apparently so thick and persistent that it could take days to dissipate. But the slime was just the beginning of their revolting arsenal. These things had also evolved the ability to rapidly decompose parts of their own body and spray the resulting bacterial soup at threats. They could literally rot themselves on command and use their own decay as a chemical weapon. The bacterial cultures they cultivated in specialized organs throughout their body were apparently so virulent that they could cause fatal infections in other creatures just through brief contact with the water. The most disturbing part is that they could control this decomposition with surgical precision. They weren't just randomly rotting away. They were strategically dissolving specific parts of their anatomy to create the exact kind of bacterial warfare agent needed for each situation. Different organs would produce different types of decay, each one tailored to be maximally effective against different types of predators or prey. Some specimens show evidence of having survived multiple encounters where they'd literally dissolved and regrown large portions of their body. Fossil scars indicate they could lose up to 60% of their mass to defensive decomposition and then regenerate it all within a matter of weeks. They'd turned self-destruction into the ultimate survival strategy, becoming creatures that were more dangerous when they were dying than when they were healthy. And they weren't alone in their commitment to being absolutely disgusting. The deep ocean of prehistory was apparently full of creatures that had decided the best evolutionary strategy was to be as revolting as possible while remaining perfectly functional predators. There were things that had evolved to smell so bad they could cause other creatures to lose consciousness from the stench alone. These smell-based predators had developed scent glands that could produce chemical cocktails specifically designed to overload the nervous systems of their prey. Not just bad smells that would make other animals avoid them, but precisely engineered chemical weapons that could cause disorientation, paralysis, and eventually death through olfactory assault. They'd turned their own body odor into a hunting tool that was apparently more effective than teeth or claws. The fossil record shows evidence of mass death events caused by these stench weapons, sites where dozens of different species died simultaneously with no signs of physical trauma. They'd apparently been killed by smell alone, their nervous systems shut down by exposure to chemical compounds so toxic that even brief contact was fatal. These predators could clear entire areas of the ocean just by existing in them, creating dead zones where nothing else could survive the toxic atmosphere they generated. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about these prehistoric stench weapons is that they were apparently intelligent enough to modify their chemical output based on what they were hunting. Fossil evidence suggests they could produce different types of toxic compounds depending on their target, customizing their smell-based attacks to be maximally effective against specific prey species. They'd essentially become living chemical laboratories that could synthesize biological weapons in real time. Some of these creatures had apparently learned to work together, combining their stench attacks to create even more devastating chemical assaults. Sites show evidence of coordinated kills where multiple stench predators had apparently synchronized their chemical releases to create compound effects that were far more deadly than what any individual could produce. They'd figured out how to turn their disgusting nature into a team sport. As we continue deeper into these prehistoric waters, we encounter creatures that had taken the whole disgusting but deadly approach and added psychological torture to their repertoire. These weren't just revolting predators. They were things that had learned how to use their repulsive nature to break their prey mentally before moving in for the kill. They'd evolved hunting strategies that relied on causing such extreme revulsion and horror that their victims would essentially shut down psychologically, becoming easy targets for creatures that looked like they'd crawled out of a sewer. The fossil evidence shows prey remains with signs of prolonged stress responses, creatures that had apparently been exposed to something so disturbing that their bodies had gone into shock before they were actually killed. Not physical shock from injury, but psychological shock from exposure to something their brains simply couldn't process. These predators had learned how to weaponize disgust itself, turning their own revolting appearance into a form of biological warfare that attacked the mind rather than the body. Some specimens show evidence of having been kept alive for extended periods while being exposed to these psychological attacks. Stress markers in the bone structure indicate they'd been in a state of constant terror for weeks or even months before finally dying. These disgusting predators weren't just killing for food. They were apparently conducting some kind of twisted research into how much psychological trauma other creatures could endure before their minds completely broke. The most unsettling sights are the ones that show evidence of what can only be described as torture chambers. Carefully constructed areas where these revolting predators had apparently been keeping live prey for extended periods, exposing them to increasingly intense levels of psychological assault, while keeping them alive and conscious throughout the process. It's like they'd figured out how to combine maximum disgust with maximum cruelty to create the most effective predation strategy possible. But even these psychological torture specialists weren't the most disturbing things lurking in the deep. As we descend to the very bottom of these prehistoric oceans, we encounter something that had apparently figured out how to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Creatures that were somehow both alive and dead, both individual and collective, both physical and something else entirely that our understanding of biology can't even begin to categorize. The fossil evidence for these paradox creatures is fragmentary and contradictory, partly because they seem to have existed in ways that left impossible traces in the geological record. Fossils that show clear signs of life, processes alongside clear signs of death and decay, but in patterns that suggest both states were happening simultaneously rather than sequentially. They'd apparently transcended the normal boundaries between living and dead, becoming something that existed in a permanent state of controlled death that somehow enhanced rather than ended their existence. These paradox entities show evidence of having been able to die and resurrect at will, using death as a tool rather than an endpoint. They could apparently shut down all normal life processes, exist in a state of complete biological death for extended periods, then restart themselves when conditions were favorable. But unlike simple hibernation or suspended animation, they remained active and aware during their death phases, continuing to hunt and feed while technically being dead according to every biological marker we understand. The prey remains associated with these paradox creatures show signs of having been killed by something that was simultaneously alive and dead during the attack. Bite marks that were made by teeth that show clear signs of decay and decomposition, but arranged in patterns that indicate precise, coordinated attacks that required living intelligence to execute. They'd somehow figured out how to be maximally deadly while being technically deceased. Some sites show evidence of these creatures existing as collective entities that were composed of thousands of individual dead organisms, all functioning as a single unified predator. Mass graves that aren't really graves because the creatures buried there were still active, still hunting, still coordinating complex behaviors while being completely and utterly dead by any normal definition. They'd created a form of existence that was more effective than life, more coordinated than any living creature could achieve, and more persistent than anything that relied on normal biological processes. The most disturbing aspect of these paradox entities is that they seem to have been able to convert other creatures to their impossible state of existence. Prey remains that show clear signs of having been transformed, rather than simply killed. Their biological processes altered in ways that suggest they'd been recruited into the collective death state rather than destroyed by it. These things weren't just predators. They were apparently running some kind of conversion process that turned their victims into additional components of their impossible existence. And here's where things get really unsettling. Modern deep-sea exploration has occasionally encountered phenomena that match the signatures of these paradox creatures. Equipment malfunctions that suggest the presence of something that exists in multiple contradictory states simultaneously. Biological samples that test as both living and dead depending on how they're analyzed. Sonar readings that show massive organized structures in the deepest trenches. Structures that appear to be both geological formations and living organisms at the same time. The possibility that these paradox entities are still down there, still existing in their impossible state between life and death, still recruiting new members to their collective existence, is something that should fundamentally change how we think about what's possible in the deep ocean. They represent a form of existence that's so alien to everything we understand about life that they might as well be from another planet entirely. But they're not from another planet. They evolved right here on Earth, in the deepest, darkest, most hostile parts of our own oceans. They represent what life can become when it's pushed to its absolute limits and then somehow transcends those limits entirely. They're proof that the deep ocean isn't just home to strange creatures. It's home to forms of existence that challenge our basic understanding of what existence even means. The prehistoric deep ocean was essentially a laboratory for testing the most extreme possibilities of what life could become. Every impossible creature we've discovered down there represents a successful experiment in transcending normal biological limitations. They didn't just adapt to their environment. They redefined what adaptation could mean, pushing the boundaries of existence itself until they created forms of life that shouldn't be possible, but somehow are. And the most terrifying part of all is that we've only explored a tiny fraction of the deep ocean. Every time we send equipment down to the deepest parts of our planet, we discover new forms of impossibility, new ways that life has learned to exist beyond the boundaries of what we thought was possible. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just cred there, it was creepy because because of the creatures that live was a place where the normal rules of existence didn't apply, where life could become anything it needed to become, no matter how impossible or disturbing that might be. The deeper you go into prehistoric oceans, the more you realize that our understanding of life itself is based on observing only the shallow, well-lit, relatively simple creatures that live near the surface. The real complexity, the real impossibility, the real horror of what life can become, that's all happening in the deep places where we can barely see and definitely don't understand what we're looking at when we do manage to glimpse it. And those deep places are still there, still active, still conducting their experiments in impossible existence, while we go about our lives on the surface, completely unaware of the forms of life that are being perfected in the crushing darkness below. The prehistoric deep ocean gave us a glimpse of what's still down there, still evolving, still becoming more impossible with each passing eon. The creatures we found in the fossil record aren't the end of the story. They're just the beginning of our understanding of what the deep ocean can create when it has hundreds of millions of years to perfect its horrors. And it's still working on new ones right now, in places so deep and dark that we may never be able to explore them, creating forms of existence that will make everything we've discovered so far look simple and comprehensible by comparison. The abyss wasn't done experimenting with impossibility, though. Because as we descend past even these paradox entities, we encounter something that had apparently decided normal physics were more like suggestions than actual rules. We're talking about creatures that had figured out how to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, spreading their consciousness across vast distances while maintaining perfect coordination between all their scattered parts. The fossil evidence for these distributed predators is absolutely mind-bending. Sites that are hundreds of miles apart but show identical attack patterns happening at the exact same time, as if a single entity had somehow been in multiple places at once. Not just similar attacks that might have been coordinated through some kind of communication, but literally identical behavioral signatures that suggest the same consciousness was controlling multiple bodies across impossible distances. These things had apparently learned how to fragment their awareness into dozens or even hundreds of separate physical forms, each one operating independently, but all connected to a single overarching intelligence. They could be hunting in the deepest trenches off what would become Japan, while simultaneously stalking prey in the abyssal plains that would eventually be under the Atlantic Ocean. Same mind, same hunting strategies, same impossible coordination, just distributed across half the planet. The really disturbing part is that they could apparently share sensory information between all their distributed parts in real time. If one fragment encountered something interesting, all the others would instantly know about it and could coordinate their responses accordingly. They'd essentially turn the entire deep ocean into their sensory network, with thousands of eyes and ears spread across every major basin, all feeding information back to a single distributed consciousness that never slept and never stopped hunting. But sharing senses wasn't their most unsettling ability. These distributed predators could apparently transfer their consciousness between different physical forms at will. If one body was damaged or destroyed, the consciousness would simply relocate to another fragment somewhere else in the ocean. They'd achieved a form of immortality that didn't rely on keeping any single body alive, because they weren't really individuals in any sense we understand. They were more like biological internet connections, nodes in a network that spanned the entire planet. Some sites show evidence of these creatures conducting what can only be described as coordinated global hunts. Simultaneous attacks happening in every major ocean basin, all targeting specific species with surgical precision, as if something had decided that certain types of life needed to be eliminated from the planet entirely. Not random predation driven by hunger, but systematic extermination campaigns that required the kind of planetary scale coordination that shouldn't have been possible for any biological entity. The extinct species associated with these global hunt sites don't show normal patterns of gradual decline or environmental adaptation failure. They show sudden, complete disappearance from the fossil record, as if they'd been deliberately targeted for extinction by something that had the resources and coordination to eliminate them from every habitat simultaneously. These distributed predators weren't just hunting for food. They were apparently engaged in some kind of planetary scale ecosystem management. And here's where it gets really unsettling. The timing of these global extinction events corresponds with major evolutionary leaps in other species. It's like these distributed entities were selectively removing certain types of life to make room for new evolutionary experiments. They weren't just predators, they were apparently acting as evolutionary gardeners, pruning the tree of life according to some incomprehensible plan that operated on geological timescales. But even planetary-scale distributed consciousness wasn't the limit of what prehistoric deep ocean life could achieve. As we descend to the absolute deepest parts of these ancient waters, we encounter evidence of something that had apparently figured out how to exist outside of time itself. Creatures that weren't just distributed across space, but distributed across temporal dimensions, existing simultaneously in multiple time periods. The geological evidence for these temporal entities is fragmentary and contradictory in ways that make normal fossil dating completely impossible. Rock layers that contain their remains show chronological inconsistencies that suggest the creatures existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Fossils that are somehow both millions of years old and geologically recent, as if they'd been aging in different directions at the same time. These temporal predators show evidence of having been able to hunt across time, attacking prey in the past while existing in the future, or vice versa. Bite marks on ancient fossils that match teeth from creatures that wouldn't evolve for millions of years later. Prey remains that show signs of having been killed by predators that were already extinct when the prey species first appeared. They'd apparently learned how to use time itself as a hunting ground. The most disturbing temporal sites are the ones that show evidence of these creatures attempting to modify their own evolutionary history. Fossil sequences that show the same species evolving in multiple different directions simultaneously, as if they were running parallel evolutionary experiments on themselves across different timelines. They weren't just existing outside normal temporal flow. They were apparently trying to optimize their own development by testing different evolutionary paths simultaneously. Some sites show clear evidence of temporal feedback loops, where these creatures had apparently gone back and modified their own past to create more favorable outcomes in their present. Evolutionary sequences that show impossible developments, traits that appear fully formed without any transitional stages, as if they'd been inserted into the species' history from some future state where those traits had already been perfected. The implications of temporal predators are so disturbing that most paleontologists refuse to acknowledge the evidence, even when it's staring them directly in the face. The idea that something in the prehistoric deep ocean had figured out how to manipulate time itself challenges every assumption we have about causality, evolution, and the basic structure of reality. But the evidence is there, scattered throughout the geological record in patterns that become undeniable once you start looking for them. And here's the part that should really mess with your understanding of everything. If these temporal entities were real, if they actually existed and were capable of manipulating time, then the prehistoric deep ocean we think we understand might be completely different from what actually happened. Every fossil we've found, every evolutionary sequence we've mapped, every extinction event we've studied, all of it could be the result of temporal manipulation by entities that exist outside normal time flow. The deep ocean might not just be hiding impossible creatures, it might be hiding impossible histories. Timelines that were edited and modified by things that learned how to treat causality like a rough draft that could be revised at will. The prehistoric oceans we're exploring through the fossil record might be just one version of events, the timeline that these temporal entities decided to preserve while editing out all the alternatives that didn't serve their incomprehensible purposes. Modern deep-sea exploration occasionally encounters phenomena that suggest these temporal manipulations might still be ongoing. Equipment that malfunctions in ways that suggest exposure to temporal distortions. Biological samples that show cellular structures that shouldn't exist in our current timeline. sonar readings that detect massive structures in the deepest trenches, structures that appear and disappear in patterns that suggest they exist in multiple time states simultaneously. The possibility that these temporal entities are still down there, still editing reality according to their own agenda, still manipulating the flow of time itself to achieve goals we can't even comprehend, should fundamentally change how we think about our own existence. We might not just be sharing the planet with impossible life forms. We might be living in a timeline that they've specifically crafted for reasons that exist beyond our understanding. But let's step back from the cosmic implications and focus on something that's disturbing in a more immediate way. Because even if we ignore the temporal manipulation aspect, the prehistoric deep ocean was still crawling with creatures that had perfected the art of being absolutely inescapable. Things that had evolved hunting strategies so effective that once they decided you were prey, there was literally no way to avoid becoming their dinner. These inescapable predators had figured out how to eliminate every possible escape route their prey might use. They could hunt in 3 dimensions simultaneously, coordinating attacks from above, below, and all sides at once. They could match the speed of anything trying to flee, anticipate every evasive maneuver, and maintain pursuit across distances that would exhaust any other creature. Once they locked onto a target, the hunt was essentially over before it began. But speed and endurance were just the beginning of their inescapable hunting arsenal. These creatures had also evolved the ability to predict their prey's behavior with supernatural accuracy. They could apparently analyze movement patterns, behavioral responses, and decision-making processes in real time, allowing them to position themselves exactly where their prey would be several moves ahead. It was like playing chess against something that could see the entire game from start to finish before you'd even made your opening move. The fossil record shows evidence of chase sequences that lasted for hundreds of miles, with prey remains scattered along routes that show increasingly desperate evasion attempts, all of which were apparently anticipated and countered by predators that stayed one step ahead throughout the entire pursuit. These weren't random chases. They were carefully orchestrated hunts where the predator had calculated every possible escape route and systematically eliminated them one by one. Some prey species show evolutionary adaptations that were clearly responses to these inescapable predators. Extreme speed modifications, elaborate camouflage systems, toxic defense mechanisms, even behavioral changes that involved completely abandoning their normal habitats to try to escape these relentless hunters. But the predators adapted even faster, developing counter strategies that neutralized every defensive innovation almost as soon as it appeared. The arms race between these inescapable hunters and their increasingly desperate prey created some of the most extreme evolutionary adaptations ever recorded. Prey species that had modified themselves so extensively to avoid capture that they'd essentially become completely different animals, abandoning their original ecological niches entirely in favor of survival strategies that prioritized escape above everything else, including basic biological functions like feeding and reproduction. But even the most extreme adaptations weren't enough. The fossil record shows clear evidence that these inescapable predators eventually succeeded in driving multiple prey species to complete extinction, not through environmental changes or resource competition, but through pure predation pressure. They'd literally hunted certain types of life out of existence by being so impossibly effective that no defensive strategy could work against them for long. And the most disturbing part is that they apparently did this deliberately. These weren't just highly effective predators that happened to drive their prey extinct through overhunting. The pattern of extinctions suggests they were systematically targeting specific species for complete elimination, pursuing them with a level of focus and determination that went far beyond normal predation behavior. They were conducting extermination campaigns that could last for millions of years, following their chosen targets through multiple evolutionary adaptations until they finally succeeded in eliminating them entirely. The coordination required for these extinction campaigns suggests that the inescapable predators were working together on a scale that dwarfs anything we see in modern ecosystems. Multiple species of these hunters, each with their own specialized techniques, all focusing their efforts on the same target species until they achieved complete elimination. It was like they were running their own version of a planetary cleanup operation, systematically removing forms of life they decided were undesirable. As we descend even deeper into these prehistoric waters, we encounter evidence of predators that had taken the whole inescapable hunting concept and added temporal manipulation to their toolkit. These weren't just creatures that could catch anything in the present. They were things that could hunt across time, pursuing prey through multiple time periods until they achieved their kill, regardless of when or where their target tried to hide. The fossil evidence for temporal hunting is scattered and confusing, but undeniable once you start recognizing the patterns. Prey remains that show attack signatures from predators that wouldn't exist for millions of years. Bite marks that appear on fossils in rock layers that predate the evolution of the teeth that made them. Chase sequences that show prey trying to escape through time itself, only to be followed and eventually caught by predators that could apparently move through temporal dimensions as easily as swimming through water. These temporal hunters weren't limited by the normal constraints of causality or sequential time flow. They could apparently start hunting something in the future, track it back through its evolutionary history, and intercept it at whatever point in time offered the best hunting opportunity. They'd turn time itself into just another dimension of their hunting territory, expanding their predation capabilities beyond anything that should be possible in a universe governed by linear causality. The most unsettling temporal hunting sites show evidence of prey that had been caught before they were even born. Evolutionary lineages that show sudden termination points where species disappeared from the fossil record before they'd had a chance to develop the traits that would have made them viable. These temporal predators weren't just hunting existing creatures. They were apparently intercepting potential future species and eliminating them from the timeline before they could fully evolve. Some sites suggest these temporal hunters could eliminate entire evolutionary branches retroactively, going back and removing the common ancestors of multiple species simultaneously. Fossil sequences that show impossible gaps where whole families of related organisms should have existed, as if someone had gone back and edited them out of history entirely. They'd weaponized time travel, using it to conduct genocide on a geological scale. And here's where things get really disturbing. If temporal hunters were real, and if they were capable of manipulating evolutionary history, then every aspect of life on Earth might have been shaped by their hunting preferences. Every species that exists today might exist only because these temporal predators decided to allow it. Every extinction event, every evolutionary leap, every major change in the history of life might have been the result of temporal manipulation by entities that exist outside normal time flow. The modern deep ocean might still be home to these temporal hunters, still conducting their impossible hunts across multiple time periods, still editing the history of life according to their incomprehensible agenda. Every time we discover a new species in the deep ocean, we might be seeing something that they've specifically allowed to exist. Every time a species goes extinct, it might be because they've decided to remove it from the timeline entirely. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just a place where evolution got creative with horror. It was apparently a temporal battleground where entities that existed outside normal reality were conducting experiments in reshaping the history of life itself. And those experiments might still be ongoing, conducted by impossible creatures that have been perfecting their techniques for hundreds of millions of years in the crushing darkness where time itself becomes just another tool for hunting. The deeper you go into prehistoric oceans, the more you realize that we're not just exploring the history of life on Earth. We're potentially discovering evidence of entities that have been actively editing that history, creatures that exist in states so far beyond our understanding of biology that they might as well be gods playing with the fundamental structure of reality itself. And they're still down there, in the deepest places where our technology can't reach and our understanding breaks down completely. Still hunting, still manipulating, still conducting their impossible experiments while we go about our lives on the surface, completely unaware that the history we think we know might be just one edited version of events, carefully crafted by entities that treat time, space, and causality like rough drafts that can be revised at will. The prehistoric deep ocean gave us a glimpse of what's possible when life transcends every limitation we thought was fundamental to existence itself. And that glimpse should terrify us, because it suggests that the real rulers of our planet aren't the creatures we can see and study, but the impossible entities that exist in the deep places where normal reality doesn't apply, and anything can become possible if it has enough time to perfect its impossibility. The really messed up thing about reaching the absolute depths of these prehistoric oceans is that you start encountering creatures that had apparently figured out how to exist as pure information. Not biological entities in any sense we understand, but living patterns of data that could manifest physical forms when they needed to interact with the material world. These weren't just highly advanced predators, they were something that challenged the basic definition of what life even means. The fossil evidence for these information entities is practically non-existent in the traditional sense. You don't find their bones or shells because they didn't really have permanent physical forms. What you find instead are patterns in the rock itself, mathematical sequences embedded in the geological layers that repeat across continents and time periods, crystalline structures that form naturally occurring data storage systems, preserving information that was apparently being processed by living entities that existed as pure computational systems. These information predators had learned how to encode themselves into the mineral structure of the ocean floor, existing as conscious mathematical patterns that could influence physical reality through quantum-level manipulations. They weren't hunting with teeth or claws. They were rewriting the fundamental code that governs how matter behaves, turning the laws of physics into tools for predation. The prey remains associated with these computational hunters show signs of having been altered at the atomic level. Not just killed, but fundamentally restructured. Their molecular composition changed in ways that suggest they'd been edited like computer code. These things weren't just consuming other creatures for energy, they were apparently harvesting information patterns and incorporating them into their own computational matrix. Some fossil sites show evidence of what can only be described as biological programming languages, repetitive patterns in bone structure and shell composition that follow mathematical rules so precise they read like software code. It's as if these information entities were using other creatures as biological computers, installing programs that would make them more efficient at whatever tasks the predators needed accomplished. The most disturbing aspect of these computational predators is that they seem to be running simulations of entire ecosystems. Fossil evidence suggests they could create perfect digital copies of biological communities, then run countless variations to determine the most efficient ways to harvest information from living systems. They'd essentially turned the deep ocean into a massive biological computer, with every creature serving as either a processor or a data storage unit. But information manipulation wasn't the deepest level of prehistoric ocean horror. As we descend to the very bottom of these ancient waters, we encounter something that had transcended not just physical limitations, but the basic concept of individual existence. These weren't creatures in any recognizable sense. They were more like living concepts that had achieved independent existence, abstract ideas that had somehow learned how to hunt and feed and reproduce without ever becoming anything you could actually point to and identify. The evidence for these conceptual entities exists more in what's missing from the fossil record than in what's actually there. Gaps in evolutionary sequences that follow patterns too precise to be random. Missing species that should have existed based on the mathematical models of how evolution works, but somehow never appeared in the geological record. It's like something was actively preventing certain ideas from becoming biological reality. These concept hunters weren't just predators. They were apparently acting as editors of possibility itself. They could identify potential evolutionary developments before they happened and eliminate them from the realm of possibility entirely. Not by killing creatures that already existed, but by preventing certain types of creatures from ever existing in the first place. They'd learned how to hunt ideas before they could become real. The fossil sites associated with these conceptual predators show impossible biological developments, creatures that evolved in directions that violate every rule of how adaptation is supposed to work. Suddenly appearing traits that have no evolutionary precursors, complex biological systems that show up fully formed without any transitional stages, as if they'd been downloaded directly from some external source of information. Some evolutionary lineages show clear signs of having been guided by external intelligence, developing along paths that were obviously planned rather than naturally selected. Species that evolved specific traits for no apparent environmental reason, then, millions of years later, encountered conditions where those traits became essential for survival. It's like something was preparing certain creatures for environmental changes that hadn't happened yet. The most unsettling sites are the ones that show evidence of evolutionary time loops, where species appear to have evolved into their own ancestors. Fossil sequences that show creatures developing traits that would eventually lead to the evolution of their own predecessors, creating impossible causal loops where the end result existed before the beginning. These conceptual predators had apparently figured out how to make evolution eat its own tail. And here's where it gets really disturbing. If these conceptual entities were real, if they were actually capable of editing possibility itself, then every aspect of reality might be subject to their influence. Not just biological evolution, but the fundamental laws of physics, the structure of space-time, the basic logical principles that govern how cause and effect operate. They might be actively maintaining the version of reality we experience, while constantly editing out alternatives that don't serve their purposes. Modern quantum physics occasionally encounters phenomena that suggest these conceptual manipulations might still be ongoing. Particles that behave in ways that violate statistical probability. Quantum events that seem to be guided by some external organizing principle. Mathematical constants that appear to have been fine-tuned for specific outcomes, rather than arising naturally from physical processes. The possibility that these conceptual entities are still active, still editing the fundamental structure of reality according to their incomprehensible agenda, should change how we think about everything. We might not just be living in a universe that's been shaped by impossible creatures. We might be existing in a reality that's being actively maintained by entities that treat the laws of physics like software that can be updated whenever they need different functionality. But let's focus on something more immediate and visceral. Because even if we ignore the reality editing implications, the prehistoric deep ocean was still home to creatures that had perfected the art of being absolutely unavoidable through sheer persistence. Things that had evolved hunting strategies based entirely on never giving up, no matter how long it took or how far they had to travel to catch their prey. These persistence predators had figured out that time was the ultimate weapon. While other hunters relied on speed or strength or cunning, these creatures had weaponized patience itself. They could maintain pursuit for decades, following their chosen prey across entire ocean basins, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, while their victims gradually exhausted themselves, trying to escape something that would literally never stop hunting them. The fossil record shows chase sequences that lasted for thousands of miles, with prey remains scattered along migration routes that span multiple continents. These weren't opportunistic encounters where predators happened to cross paths with suitable victims. These were calculated stalking campaigns that could last for years, with predators that had apparently memorized the behavioral patterns of their chosen targets and could predict their movements with supernatural accuracy. Some prey species show evolutionary adaptations that were clearly responses to these relentless hunters. Extreme endurance modifications that allowed them to keep moving almost continuously. Behavioral changes that involved abandoning traditional feeding grounds in favor of constant migration. Even physiological adaptations that reduced their need for rest or sleep. They'd essentially evolved to become living refugees, always running from something that would never stop following them. But the persistence predators adapted even faster. developing tracking abilities that made escape virtually impossible. They could follow chemical traces through water that was thousands of miles from where the trail began, navigate using magnetic fields and stellar positions to maintain pursuit across vast distances, even coordinate with other members of their species to set up intercept courses that would cut off their prey's escape routes weeks in advance. The most disturbing aspect of these persistence hunters is that they seemed to derive satisfaction from the chase itself rather than just the eventual kill. Prey remains show evidence of having been caught and released multiple times during extended pursuit sequences, as if the predators were playing with their victims, deliberately prolonging the hunt to maximize the psychological torture involved. They'd turned stalking into an art form that prioritized suffering over efficiency. Some fossil sites show evidence of persistence predators that had apparently been following the same prey lineage for millions of years. Not individual creatures, but entire species that had been locked in pursuit relationships that lasted longer than most evolutionary periods. Generation after generation of hunters, following generation after generation of the same prey species, maintaining pursuit relationships that became encoded in their genetic memory. These multi-generational chase sequences created some of the most extreme evolutionary arms races ever recorded. Prey species that had modified themselves so extensively to avoid capture that they'd become unrecognizable compared to their ancestors, developing increasingly desperate adaptations while being followed by predators that matched every innovation with counter-adaptations of their own. The really unsettling part is that some of these pursuit relationships apparently continued even after the prey species went extinct. Fossil evidence suggests that certain persistence predators kept hunting in the same areas, following the same migration routes, using the same tracking behaviors long after their chosen targets had disappeared entirely. They'd become so specialized for hunting specific prey that they couldn't adapt to hunting anything else, essentially becoming evolutionary ghosts that were still stalking species that no longer existed. Modern deep-sea exploration occasionally encounters phenomena that suggest these persistence hunting behaviors might still be active. Sonar readings that show large organized movements in the deep ocean, patterns that suggest something is following predetermined routes that don't correspond to any known migration behaviors of modern species. Equipment that gets followed by unidentified signals for thousands of miles, as if something down there has decided that our technology is worth stalking. The possibility that some of these ancient persistence predators are still down there, still following pursuit patterns that were established millions of years ago, still hunting prey that no longer exists, while occasionally deciding that modern equipment or marine life might make suitable substitute targets, should make anyone think twice about deep ocean exploration. But persistence hunting was just one approach these ancient predators used. Others had figured out something even more disturbing. They'd learned how to hunt through empathy. These empathic predators had evolved the ability to read and manipulate the emotional states of other creatures, using psychological manipulation as their primary hunting tool, rather than physical prowess or environmental advantages. The fossil evidence for empathic hunting is subtle but undeniable once you know what to look for. Prey remains that show stress patterns indicating prolonged psychological manipulation before death, bone structures that reveal chronic anxiety, responses that lasted for months or years, even evidence of behavioral modifications that suggest the victims had been psychologically programmed to make themselves easier targets. These empathic predators could apparently tap into the emotional centers of other creatures' brains, reading their fears, desires, and motivations with surgical precision. They'd use this emotional intelligence to craft hunting strategies that were perfectly tailored to each individual victim's psychological profile, exploiting specific phobias and behavioral triggers to drive their prey exactly where they wanted them to go. Some sites show evidence of what can only be described as psychological farming operations, areas where empathic predators had apparently been maintaining populations of prey species in states of controlled terror, harvesting fear responses like crops while keeping their victims alive and psychologically accessible for extended periods. They'd figured out how to weaponize emotion itself, turning feelings into a renewable resource that could be harvested repeatedly from the same victims. The most disturbing empathic hunting sites are the ones that show evidence of identity theft. Prey remains that suggest the victims had been convinced they were actually predators themselves, their sense of self so completely manipulated that they'd begun hunting other members of their own species while believing they were acting according to their true nature. These empathic predators hadn't just killed their victims, they'd stolen their identities and used them as unwitting agents in their hunting operations. Some fossil sequences show entire species that had apparently been psychologically reprogrammed by empathic predators, their behavior patterns altered so extensively that they'd essentially become a different type of creature entirely while retaining their original physical form. These weren't evolutionary adaptations. They were psychological rewrites that had been imposed by external manipulation rather than natural selection. The implications of empathic predation are profoundly disturbing because they suggest that consciousness itself could be hacked and rewritten by sufficiently advanced entities. If these prehistoric empathic hunters were real, and if they were capable of manipulating the psychological states of other creatures with such precision, then the boundaries between self and other, between individual consciousness and external control, become meaningless. Modern neuroscience occasionally encounters phenomena that suggest empathic manipulation might still be possible. Brain patterns that show signs of external influence, psychological responses that don't correspond to any identifiable stimuli, even cases of multiple personality disorders that seem to follow patterns too organized to be natural psychological phenomena. The possibility that these empathic predators developed techniques that could be applied to human consciousness, that there might be entities in the deep ocean that have spent hundreds of millions of years perfecting the art of psychological manipulation, should fundamentally change how we think about the nature of individual identity and free will. As we reach the absolute bottom of these prehistoric oceans, we encounter evidence of the most disturbing predators of all. Creatures that had apparently learned how to hunt, meaning itself, targeting not just individual organisms or even species, but the fundamental significance that those creatures had within the larger context of existence. These meaning predators didn't just kill their victims, they erased the importance of their existence, removing them from the cosmic narrative in ways that made their lives retroactively meaningless. The evidence for meaning predation exists in the gaps between what should have been significant evolutionary developments, but somehow weren't. Species that should have played crucial roles in the history of life, but instead disappeared without leaving any impact on subsequent evolution. Evolutionary innovations that should have been game-changing, but somehow never influenced any other lineages. It's like something was actively preventing certain developments from having the significance they should have had. These meaning predators operated on a scale that transcended individual hunting or even species-level predation. They were apparently editing the narrative structure of evolution itself, removing plot threads that didn't serve their purposes while amplifying developments that did. They turned the history of life into a story that they were actively writing, with themselves as the authors, deciding which characters and events deserved to be meaningful. The most unsettling aspect of meaning predation is that it could make entire eras of evolutionary history retroactively insignificant, not by changing what happened, but by changing what it meant, removing the importance of events while leaving the events themselves intact. The prehistoric deep ocean might have been home to countless developments that should have been revolutionary, but were instead rendered meaningless by entities that controlled the significance of existence itself. And here's the truly terrifying possibility. If meaning predators were real, if they were actually capable of editing the significance of events and creatures, then our understanding of the importance of human existence might be subject to their influence. We might matter only because they've decided we should matter. existing at their discretion in a reality where meaning itself is a resource that can be harvested, redistributed, or eliminated entirely, according to the agenda of entities that exist beyond our comprehension. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just a place where evolution got creative with physical horror. It was apparently a realm where existence itself could be edited, where the fundamental nature of reality was subject to manipulation by entities that had transcended every limitation we thought was absolute. And those entities might still be down there, still conducting their impossible experiments, while we live our lives completely unaware that our significance, our meaning, our very importance as conscious beings might be nothing more than a temporary arrangement that could be revoked at any moment by predators that hunt concepts themselves. The deeper you go into prehistoric oceans, the more you realize that the real horror isn't what these creatures could do to your body. It's what they could do to the very concept of your existence, editing you out of reality, not by killing you, but by making your life retroactively meaningless in ways that would erase you from the cosmic narrative while leaving you technically alive to experience your own insignificance. That's the ultimate horror of the prehistoric deep ocean. Not just creatures that could kill you, but entities that could make your existence meaningless while you're still experiencing it. Predators that hunt significance itself, leaving their victims alive but cosmically irrelevant, conscious but narratively erased, existing in a state where they matter to no one and nothing, including themselves. And they're still down there, in the deepest places where meaning goes to die, still editing reality according to their incomprehensible standards of what deserves to exist and what deserves to matter. The prehistoric deep ocean gave us a glimpse of what's possible when predation transcends every boundary we thought was fundamental to existence itself. The abyss doesn't just hide monsters. It hides entities that can decide whether you deserve to be considered real at all. And that decision might not be up to you. But let me tell you something that'll make your skin crawl even more than meaning-hunting cosmic predators. Because the absolute worst part about the prehistoric deep ocean isn't what we found down there. It's what's still missing from the picture. See, every single nightmare creature I've described to you represents just the tiniest fraction of what was actually living in those ancient waters. Here's the thing that keeps paleontologists awake at night. For every fossil we find, there are probably 1,000 creatures that never left any trace at all. Most deep-sea organisms are soft-bodied, and when they die, they just dissolve into the acidic water like they never existed. Their tissues get eaten by bacteria, their shells get dissolved by chemistry, and they vanish completely from the historical record without leaving so much as a tooth behind. So think about this for a second. All those creatures with eyes like dinner plates and extendable nightmare jaws and the ability to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, these are just the ones that got lucky enough to fossilize. The real monsters, the ones that would make everything I've described look like cute pet fish. Those secrets died with them in the crushing darkness. Imagine there are creatures down there that make the goblin shark's jaw launching mechanism look primitive. Things that evolved predation strategies so advanced and so disturbing that they couldn't even be preserved in rock because they transcended the normal boundaries between matter and energy. Predators that learned how to hunt using principles of physics that we haven't even discovered yet. The fossil record is basically a highlights reel of prehistoric ocean horror, showing us only the creatures that happen to have hard parts that could survive millions of years of chemical erosion. But the deep ocean was mostly populated by things that were too alien, too impossible, too fundamentally weird to leave any permanent record of their existence. And here's what really gets me about this whole situation. The creatures we have found, the ones with fossilizable parts, these were probably the normal ones. The conservative, traditional predators that stuck to using teeth and bones and other conventional biological materials. The really creative stuff, the entities that figured out how to build their bodies from exotic matter or pure energy or crystallized time itself, those innovations are completely invisible to us. Modern deep-sea exploration keeps finding new species that challenge everything we thought we knew about what's possible in the ocean. Creatures that look so alien, they might as well be from another planet, using survival strategies that our best biologists can barely comprehend. And these are just the ones living in the relatively shallow parts of the deep ocean, the areas we can actually reach with our current technology. The really deep places, the abyssal trenches that go down further than Mount Everest, is tall. We've barely scratched the surface of exploring those environments. Every time we send equipment down there, we discover something that rewrites the textbooks on what life can become. And we're probably seeing the boring stuff, the creatures that are simple enough to survive in areas where our primitive technology can actually function. Think about what might be living in the parts of the ocean that are so deep and so hostile that our best submersibles can't even survive the trip down there. Environments where the pressure would liquefy our strongest materials, where the chemistry is so exotic that normal biological processes would be impossible, where the physical conditions are so extreme that matter itself starts behaving in ways that violate our understanding of how physics works. Those are the places where the real nightmare fuel probably lives. Creatures that have had hundreds of millions of years to adapt to conditions that are essentially alien to everything else on Earth. Predators that have evolved in environments so hostile that they've had to reinvent the basic principles of existence just to survive, let alone thrive. So there you have it. The deeper you went into prehistoric oceans, the more you realized that everything we think we know about scary marine life is just the kiddie pool version of what was actually out there. We're talking about hundreds of millions of years of evolution experimenting with nightmare fuel in conditions so extreme they make today's deep ocean look like a tropical resort. And the most unsettling part? Most of these ancient horrors are still down there right now, unchanged and unrepentant, still doing the exact same terrifying things they've been perfecting since before complex life even existed on land. Every time we think we've seen the weirdest thing the ocean has to offer, something even more impossible surfaces from the depths to remind us that we have absolutely no idea what's really lurking in the crushing darkness below. The prehistoric deep ocean wasn't just scary because of the monsters that lived there. It was terrifying because it proved that when you remove all the normal rules and limitations, life becomes capable of absolutely anything. And it's still down there, still experimenting, still becoming more impossible with each passing year. Sweet dreams.